Hello wonderful person, this is Anton, and in this video we're going to tackle a very unusual question that many scientists and philosophers grappled with for centuries. The question of consciousness, or I guess more specific, the reasons for consciousness, or that feeling of being me, which though is a subjective experience, is still something that we're pretty certain exists out there, even in other animals. And so this idea of awareness of existence, feelings and thoughts, that for a very long time was believed to be purely a human condition, today, mostly based on a lot of neuroscience studies, seems to be the result of our physical brain giving rise to this inner world inside of us. But here the problem was always this idea of other minds. How do we know which other creatures or which other animals on Earth share this experience? Mostly because in this case we cannot just ask them, and trying to figure out if they are conscious is by itself kind of challenging. And so in the past the assumption was that consciousness required very complex layered cerebral cortex, mostly found in mammals and especially primates, which is why for a very long time, especially in the earlier 20th century, consciousness was attributed to only humans, chimps, gorillas, and sometimes also dolphins and whales. But a lot of recent research, especially studies we're going to be discussing today, focused on an entirely different types of animals that today we're pretty certain is conscious as well. And here we're talking about a surprisingly intelligent group of animals, because here, based on some of the recent studies, the results may force us to redefine what we believe consciousness is, and basically redefine the minimum requirements for this somewhat subjective experience. And so in this video we're going to be diving into these two recent studies on the consciousness in birds and the different types of consciousness, which essentially focuses on trying to define exactly what this phenomenon is, with the overall conclusion being that ability to be self-aware and having a complexity for a lot of different thought is definitely not just a mammalian trait. But I guess first, before we start, let's establish exactly what we're discussing, just so that there's no confusion. And so at its simplest, consciousness is just awareness. Being aware of internal states like feelings or anxieties, and of course of various external objects in your environment. But obviously the definition depends on who you ask. A lot of philosophers will probably have a different definition from a lot of scientists. And because this is a scientific channel, we're mostly going to focus on that. And in terms of a scientific definition, a lot of modern propositions focus on the idea of several levels of awareness. For example, in one of the more recent models, the alarm model, the idea is to look at consciousness as having at least three specific phenomena with three different functions, with the first level here being very simple: basic arousal. This would be the most basic and the most fundamental level, focused on keeping the organism alive. So essentially having various alarm systems and focusing on things like pain, hunger and distress that does not require any complex neurocortex, and most likely relies on some of the older brain systems like the upper brainstem and thalamus. And the main function for this is pretty obvious: survival. And this is of course a type of consciousness that we now believe a lot of different animals possess. But things get a little bit more complex when we move on to the next level: general alertness. And this is what most humans experience daily. This involves selective and goal-directed attention, allowing the organism or an animal to focus on very specific sensory signals. And so basically here we start making decisions based on what we're paying attention to, and also based on what we see and detect in our environment. And the third level is referred to as the reflexive self-consciousness. This is of course the famous "I think, therefore I am." And so here this is the awareness of one's own mindset, or even the mindset of others. So here this is a type of a metacognition. In other words, being able to think about our own thoughts or thoughts of others. And the primary function for this level is to enable complex future-directed planning, especially long-term planning, that does not just involve survival right away, but may involve something at much longer time frames. But importantly, today we also believe that consciousness by itself, or sentience in general, seems to be directly linked and possibly stems from the idea of pain, or the capacity to feel pain and suffering, with sentience essentially trying to prevent pain through complex behavior. And so interestingly, back in 2012, there was a very important major consensus referred to as the Cambridge Declaration of Consciousness. This confirmed that quite a lot of non-human animals, including mammals and birds, seem to possess the necessary neural basis for consciousness required for complex behavior, with this acknowledgement becoming a major scientific shift. But the main question here is, why 2012? And I guess, why were birds initially overlooked and not actually believed to be conscious? In other words, why is it that for a very long time, consciousness was not actually attributed to birds? And well, the answer here is actually pretty simple. It's because of the initial propositions that consciousness seems to be created in specific regions of the brain which birds actually did not possess. Specifically, it was related to the very complex mammalian cerebral cortex. And birds, as you might know, have a very structurally different brain and generally lack the structure and that layer cortex responsible for consciousness in humans, which is why for a lot of neuroscientists it was kind of difficult to explain what's going on. But in reality, they all knew that certain birds, especially corvids, so here we're talking about crows, ravens and magpies, and of course quite a few parrots, seem to actually display consciousness at all times and also seem to be some of the most intelligent animals on the planet. I mean, you might have seen videos of crows opening bottles in order to drink water, or even using tools in order to retrieve food. And that's of course despite the fact that their brains were just different. But in terms of brain anatomy, there was actually something very remarkable: neuronal density. Bird brains seem to have a much higher neuronal density, up to 2 to maybe 4 times, compared to a typical mammal. And that means that their brains can achieve much higher efficiency despite having smaller heads. On top of this, the way they process information also seems to be very different. And so here, based on some of the most recent research and a lot of new propositions such as the global neuronal workspace theory, scientists concluded that a lot of these advanced cognitive abilities in various birds seems to arise from a completely different architecture and from completely different neural networks. In other words, they seem to have evolved a functionally equivalent circuit in a very different part of the brain that seems to produce similar complex behavior, but by using completely different parts. And so here this is a perfect example of what's known as convergent evolution. Basically, a development of a very similar trait in completely unrelated organisms that seems to produce similar results or has very similar form and function, despite being developed in completely different ways. So I guess a very simple example here would be flight in birds versus insects. But in this case, because we also have signs of consciousness in birds, it looks like they might have evolved something very similar in terms of function, but in a very different part of the brain, in this case referred to as avian pallium. You can see some of the comparison right here between a human brain, a bird brain, and even a reptile brain. And so it looks like this is functionally analogous to a typical mammalian cerebral cortex and is also responsible for higher cognitive functions. Naturally, as you can see, crocodiles have this too, so we can maybe attribute some similar functions to them as well. The point here is that despite different physical structures, they still seem to perform very similar function and still seem to create this idea of consciousness. And so the key here is how the neural circuits are wired and not just the physical layers and actual structures. But how do we see this intelligence and this consciousness play out? And how can we even tell that it's there? Well, normally scientists look for very specific behaviors that may suggest higher cognitive abilities that can then be used as evidence for consciousness and self-awareness. And the most famous example is what's known as the mirror test. This has been used with a lot of different animals, and it's a classic test for self-recognition that involves putting some kind of a marker on the animal's body, for example some kind of a little red dot that can only be seen in a mirror. And so if the animal tries to touch and remove the dot and tries to clean itself while basically looking in the mirror, it means that the animal recognizes itself. And based on previous studies, we know that quite a lot of different apes, quite a lot of mammals like elephants, dolphins and orcas, and of course birds like magpies, seem to have easily passed the test, suggesting self-awareness. But importantly, not passing a test does not mean that the animal lacks self-awareness. It just means that some of these tests may not have been designed properly yet, or the animal might not just be aware of the mirror, or may not even see very well. And while the first birds, or the first non-mammals to pass the test, were magpies. And here we even have a video of this magpie trying to remove the spot by trying to clean itself. But it did not take long to find other birds that could do the same. At first it was just various corvids, but eventually scientists realized that quite a few birds seem to actually pass the test if you design it correctly, or if you modify the test just a little bit. For example, when it comes to pigeons, which you'd think may not be self-aware, just based on how they bop their heads around, not caring about anything, turns out you can actually train them to use a mirror to locate objects. which is definitely a type of self-awareness as well. And more recently, studies show that pigeons can recognize temporal proximity between their own movements and the corresponding video feedback showing themselves, essentially suggesting that they seem to be self-aware at least to some extent, or at least have some kind of a temporal self-sensitivity. And while not all birds pass this test, in some of the previous studies, roosters seem to, for example, produce different alarm calls depending on who they notice. For example, if a rooster sees a predator's shadow, it seems to give a warning call if the rooster is aware that there's another rooster nearby. But if it only sees its own reflection in the mirror, it actually doesn't do anything. It remains silent. In other words, here, a modification of this test suggests that even roosters seem to be self-aware, which suggests that roosters discriminate their own reflection from another rooster and know exactly when to sound the alarm if there's any danger nearby. But I mean, just as a side note, when it comes to this test and when it comes to trying to find consciousness, it actually gets really complicated, especially based on studies like this. Here, back in 2015, scientists discovered that even some ants seem to recognize themselves when looking in a mirror. And specifically, if you were to place a mirror versus a glass, showing other ants on the other side, they actually seem to change their behavior and move their bodies and heads very differently if they're looking at themselves versus looking at someone else. But the craziest part of this experiment was, of course, the mark. If they were to place a tiny blue mark on the ant's face, turns out the ants with blue dots would actually groom themselves and appear to try to remove the marking if it was seen in the mirror. And what's even more intriguing here is that if you were to place these blue dotted ants with other normal ants, other ants would respond aggressively because they would assume that this is an outsider and not the member of the colony, which actually explains why those ants were trying to remove the dot desperately, because it made them appear differently. But just the fact that they were aware they had those dots is already pretty mind-blowing. And so, at least based on this study, the team behind it believes that this was an example of self-recognition even in tiny animals like ants. And we'll actually discuss the idea behind ant intelligence and ant consciousness in some of the future videos, which I'm basically planning right now. So do subscribe if you'd like to learn more. But back to birds. So we have pigeons, roosters, a lot of different corvids, and all of them seem to display at least some consciousness to some extent. Not to mention that many of them can also use tools and display very advanced planning. For example, some of the crows in New Caledonia are notorious for using sticks to extract insects, and some can even create hooks in order to fish out different insects from inside the tree. Whereas some other birds, such as for example jays, tend to cache a lot of food for the future and even come up with plans on where they're going to be hiding it in order to avoid other birds from stealing the food. So here we have a lot of examples of complex social cognitive behavior and a lot of abilities usually attributed to the theory of mind in humans. And so here for neurosciences, the next question was to try to figure out, okay, so where exactly is all of this happening? And can we actually find an equivalent to a human brain or a primate brain inside the bird brain? And turns out that there have been some big breakthroughs in the last few years. By looking at specific brain patterns inside birds, researchers discovered that a lot of it seems to happen in a location referred to as nidopallium caudolateral, or NCL for short. And so this would be the example of the prefrontal cortex that a lot of primates use for very similar reasons. Here's where it's located for a typical pigeon. And NCL in this case seems to be functionally equivalent to the mammalian prefrontal cortex and heavily involved in consciousness and executive functions. And in this case, all of this was discovered by training crows on a somewhat difficult to detect target, where in many cases they were then forced to reason and come up with some kind of a solution by activating more advanced areas of the brain. And so in crows, the activity inside NCL seemed to represent the example of conscious experience and complex planning. And so several neurophysiological and anatomical studies definitively confirm that birds have the neural architecture required for consciousness. And so here, by comparing this to ideas behind human consciousness, researchers essentially came up with three important insights. The first one is referred to as global neural workspace theory. This theory suggests that consciousness is essentially kind of like a brain-wide public announcement system that seems to arise when a piece of sensory information is important enough that it has to be selected, amplified, and then broadcast to other regions of the brain. The second idea is referred to as recurrent processing theory, that states that the consciousness does not rely on signals traveling one way, but requires a continuous two-way communication between completely different brain regions in order to amplify the information and in order to come up with the necessary conclusion. So basically here perception doesn't just occur in one direction, and instead signal travels back and forth repeatedly, confirming the information over time. Lastly, we have the integrated information theory that suggests that consciousness corresponds to the system in order to integrate information and in order to create some kind of an overall picture of what's being observed. And so right now there seems to be quite a lot of evidence that birds seem to do pretty much the same information processing as primates and of course humans. And so here many of these discoveries, especially from some of the recent studies, change our understanding of evolution of mind and of course the evolution of consciousness. Here this is no longer seen as just something that's uniquely human or even primate, but instead something that started to form as far back as 300 million years ago, when some of our ancient ancestors separated and became different species. And so in this research, a lot of evidence points at the idea of consciousness being a lot more widespread than we initially thought, and mostly because nature found different architectural blueprints to basically create the same subjective experience. It does not seem to involve specific brain parts or specific brain regions, and seems to have different neuronal pathways. Once again, this is a perfect example of convergent evolution. But this particular discovery also proves something super important. It actually implies that the idea of consciousness is an evolutionary advantage, and so being self-conscious seems to be very beneficial for most species. Obviously, it provides mechanisms for higher level functions, such as for example advanced learning or long-term planning, but it also seems to provide additional essential survival strategies, especially in changing environments. But this is of course just the beginning for this research, because most of this really only started like a decade ago. And so some of the future scientific studies are planning to take this just a little bit further, and specifically by coming up with new objective metrics, such as what's known as perturbational complexity index, specifically applicable to birds. And the main point here is going to be trying to figure out if consciousness is basically some kind of a multi-level process, or if it's just some kind of an on-off switch, and also trying to find the absolute minimal requirement for self-awareness in the animal kingdom. If ants are self-aware, what about other insects? But at least for now, the mystery of consciousness is still a mystery. This is still not a question we can easily answer, but thanks to our feathered friends, we're slowly gaining a little bit more information and are slowly understanding it just a little bit more. And once again, not from a philosophical perspective, but really from a perspective of biology. But we'll definitely come back and discuss these ideas in some of the future videos once there are some new discoveries. Until then, check out previous videos in the description. Thank you for watching, subscribe, come back tomorrow to learn something else, support the channel on Patreon where you can find additional videos without any ads and can DM me directly, or by joining a channel membership that grants you early access. You can also buy the Wonderful Person t-shirt in the description below. Stay wonderful, I'll see you tomorrow, and as always, bye bye.